She did not choose this life. It was sold to her at half price by the one man who should have protected her. What begins as a transaction between desperate men will become a story of two wounded souls learning that the most unforgiving land on earth cannot harden a heart that was built to endure. Before this story ends, one man will burn down everything he ever loved, and one woman will pick up a hammer instead of walking away. Stay until the last ember. You will understand why. The morning Clara Hadley left Philadelphia, the city smelled of coal smoke and rain-soaked cobblestones, and she carried exactly two things worth keeping. One was a small leather trunk, dark brown and scuffed at the corners, packed with sensible dresses, and a single book of poetry she had owned since girlhood. The other was a silence so complete and so deliberate that even the porter who hoisted her trunk onto the rack above her seat could feel it radiating from her like cold from a winter window. He did not attempt conversation. People rarely did with women who looked the way Clara looked that morning, as though they had already said everything that needed saying and found it made no difference. She was 24 years old, and she had learned in the span of one terrible conversation 3 weeks prior that love was a word men used when they meant something else entirely. Her father, Nathaniel Hadley, had delivered the news in his study. He stood behind his mahogany desk, the way he always stood behind things, using solid objects as a kind of moral fortification, and he explained the arrangement in the same tone he used to discuss ledger entries and outstanding debts. Matter of fact, almost bored. A cattle rancher in the territory of Wyoming had responded to an advertisement. The terms were agreeable. Clara would be on a train by the end of the month. She had asked him very quietly if he understood what he was saying. He had told her she was being dramatic. She had not cried. That surprised her later when she had the privacy to examine her own reactions. She had expected tears the way you expect rain when the sky turns that particular shade of green. But what came instead was something colder and more permanent. It was the sensation of a door closing inside her chest, heavy and final, the kind of door with a bolt that slides home with a sound like a judgment. She had looked at her father across the gleaming surface of his desk, and she had understood with a clarity that felt almost scientific that she was entirely alone in the world, and had perhaps always been. She did not slam doors on her way out of his study. She did not raise her voice. She walked upstairs, sat on the edge of her bed, and began making an inventory of what she would pack. There was a particular dignity in deciding what to take when you were given no choice about going. The train west was 3 days of relentless motion of landscape, transforming outside the window like pages turning in a book she had not asked to read. Philadelphia dissolved into the rolling green of Pennsylvania farmland. The farmland gave way to the broad, muscular sweep of the Ohio River Valley. Then came the flatness, the extraordinary, almost aggressive flatness of the Middle Plains, where the sky stopped being background and became the main event, enormous and indifferent, pressing down on a land that simply endured it. Clara watched all of this through the smudged glass and felt something shift in her understanding of scale. She had grown up in a city of tight streets and tall buildings that interrupted your view of the horizon at every turn. Out here, there was no interruption. The horizon was the whole story, and it went on forever. She ate sparingly from a small tin of crackers and a piece of hard cheese she had brought from home, unwilling to spend money she might need later on the dining car. She slept in her seat upright and with her arms folded across her chest, waking periodically to find the stars had moved and the darkness outside had deepened to a new shade of absolute. She did not speak to the other passengers. A woman traveling alone in 1882 was either the subject of pity or suspicion, and Clara was not interested in being either. She read her poetry book by the light of the small oil lamp mounted above her seat, and when the words blurred with exhaustion, she closed the book and rested her forehead against the cool glass and watched the darkness move past, and she thought about what kind of woman she intended to be on the other side of this journey. Because the woman she had been the obedient daughter, the quiet girl who softened her voice when her father frowned, that woman had led her here to a westbound train and an unknown man and a life she had not chosen. That woman had trusted the wrong people. She made herself a promise there in the dark, with the wheels turning beneath her and the stars wheeling above. She would work. She would endure. She would not break. But she would not give herself, the real and essential herself, to anyone who had not proven themselves worthy of the gift. Trust from this point forward was not a thing she would offer freely. It would have to be earned the way everything real was earned slowly and at considerable cost. She slept again briefly, and when she woke, the sky outside the window was turning the pale, uncertain color of early dawn, and somewhere behind her a child was crying, and ahead of her there was nothing but the long, straight rail driving west into the light. The station at Drybone Valley was smaller than she had expected, which was itself remarkable because she had expected very little. It was a raw lumber platform elevated perhaps 18 inches off the ground, with a single building that served as both the ticket office and the telegraph station. Its pine boards still pale and new, not yet weathered to the silver gray that would come with years of wind and sun. There was a water tower. There was a loading pen for livestock that was empty at this hour. The gate hanging open, the packed earth inside it, stained dark in the corners with evidence of its usual purpose. There was a hand-painted sign that read, "Drybone Valley, established 1879, as though the town were proud of its own recency, pleased to have arrived at all." Clara stepped down from the train car and stood on the platform with her trunk at her feet, and took in the full scope of what she had come to. The town, such as it was, sat at the edge of a broad valley that ran north to south between two long ridge lines, both of them brown and sage-stubbled and enormous, the kind of geological features that made human constructions look apologetic. The main street of Drybone Valley was unpaved and perhaps 200 yards long, lined on each side by a collection of buildings in varying states of completion, a general store, a livery, a structure with a hand-lettered sign advertising meals, and a room another building without a sign that Clara would later learn was the saloon. Beyond the town, in every direction, the land opened into something vast and austere, and very nearly silent, broken only by the dry whisper of the wind moving through the grass. She had grown up understanding beauty as a thing of human construction gardens and architecture and the careful arrangement of civilized spaces. This was something different. This was the beauty of a thing that did not care whether you found it beautiful or not. The beauty of sheer, unrelenting scale of land that had been here long before anyone thought to name it, and would be here long after the name was forgotten. She was still cataloging this impression when she became aware that she was being watched. He was standing at the far end of the platform, near where the steps descended to the dirt road below, a man of perhaps 35, and the first thing she noticed about him was his stillness. He was not leaning against the post beside him, exactly, more like he had simply chosen to stand near it, and happened to share its quality of being rooted to the earth without effort or performance. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of build that comes not from deliberate exercise, but from years of work that demands everything your body has. His face was deeply weathered, sun-darkened, and wind-scored with lines around the eyes from squinting into the light of this enormous sky. He wore canvas work pants and a flannel shirt, the color of dust, and boots that had been resoled at least once. His hat was battered. His expression was unreadable, in the way that certain landscapes are unreadable, not because nothing is happening there, but because it is happening very slowly under the surface in geological time. He was not holding flowers. He was not smiling. He looked at her the way a man looks at a piece of land he is considering purchasing, assessing terrain, noting features, calculating utility. It was not unkind precisely, but it was not warm. Clara straightened her spine, lifted her chin by perhaps 1/4 of an inch, which was all the signal she would give that she was aware of being evaluated, and met his gaze across the 30 feet of platform between them. They looked at each other for a moment that felt in the way such moments sometimes do considerably longer than it actually was. Then he nodded, a single short economical movement of the head. Acknowledgement. Nothing more. He walked toward her, and when he reached her, he picked up her trunk without being asked, without commenting on its weight or its size, and turned and walked down the steps toward a wagon waiting in the road below. A single horse was hitched to it, a bay mare of no particular distinction, though she stood quietly and looked at nothing, with the calm authority of an animal that has worked long enough to know there is no point in excitement. Clara followed him down the steps. She did not wait to be invited. He set her trunk in the wagon bed and climbed to the driver's seat and gathered the reins. She climbed up on the passenger side without assistance and settled herself on the board seat, which was bare wood and not comfortable, and folded her hands in her lap. He clicked his tongue, and the mare began to move. They drove out of Drybone Valley in silence. It was not the silence of awkwardness exactly. It was more like the silence of two people who have not yet determined what, if anything, they have to say to each other. Clara had half expected on the train that she would be asked questions. "Where are you from? What do you know about ranch work? Can you cook?" She had prepared careful, measured answers, not warm but not cold, the answers of a woman establishing terms. But he asked nothing. He drove with the reins loose in his hands and his eyes on the road ahead, and the landscape rolled past in all its brown and amber immensity, and Clara sat beside a stranger who was now her husband and listened to the wind. His name was Elias Voss, and she knew almost nothing about him beyond what her father's arrangement had required. He had filed a homestead claim on 320 acres of Wyoming territory in 1878. He ran cattle. He had built a house and a barn. He needed a Wife the Homestead Act, being more generously disposed toward married couples, and also someone to manage the household, because a man doing the work of running a ranch alone had no capacity left for the work of running a home. That was the sum of her knowledge. She studied him sidelong as they rode the way you study a landscape from a moving train in pieces without letting on that you are paying attention. The set of his jaw, the competent efficiency with which he handled the reins. The way he tracked movement at the edge of the road, a jackrabbit startled into flight by the wagon, a hawk circling something in the middle distance, with the automatic awareness of a man whose survival has depended on knowing what was happening at the edge of his vision. He was not a soft man. She had not expected him to be. But she had hoped in some private corner of herself she would not have admitted to on that train for something. A gesture. A word. Some acknowledgement that she was a person and not a package he had ordered through the mail. The gesture did not come. The ranch appeared after 40 minutes of driving, emerging from the landscape in pieces. First the windmill, its blades turning slowly in the persistent breeze, then the roof of the barn, then the house itself, a low structure of rough-cut timber and stone, more substantial than she had expected, which surprised her, and then immediately she analyzed the surprise and understood it. She had been bracing for the worst possible version of this place, preparing herself to manage on minimal means, and the fact that the house had a real foundation and glass in the windows, and a porch, small but actual, was a kind of relief she had not been expecting to feel. He pulled the wagon around to the side of the house and set the brake and climbed down. "House is there," he said. His voice was lower than she expected and unhurried, as though words were a resource he spent carefully. "Kitchen front room, 2 rooms in the back. You take the one on the right." "And you," she said. Not a question exactly, a notation. "Left," he said. "I see." He lifted her trunk from the wagon bed and carried it to the door and set it inside on the front room floor. Then he turned and looked at her with that same appraising stillness from the platform, and he said in the same tone you might use to describe the terms of a livestock contract, "I work from first light to after dark. I'll want supper by 7 when I come in, breakfast at 5. I don't need conversation, and I don't need fuss. I need someone to hold up their end." Clara looked back at him with the same steadiness. "And the legal matter," she said. "Judge rode through last Tuesday. Certificate is on the table." He paused. "It's done." She nodded once. The same small economy of motion he had offered her on the platform. Mirror and response. He went back out to the wagon, and she heard him lead the mare toward the barn, and she stood in the front room of the house that was now hers to manage, and looked at the marriage certificate sitting on the rough wooden table, and felt the door in her chest, the one she had bolted on the train, hold firm. Good, she told herself, keep it bolted. The house was a chaos beneath its structural soundness. That much became apparent within the first hour of her inventory. Elias Voss was a man of considerable practical competence and almost no domestic organization whatsoever. The kitchen was functional but disorderly in the way of a space used entirely without system. Pans stacked wherever they had last been set down. Flour and salt and cornmeal in sacks that had not been properly closed and showed evidence of mice. A skillet with a residue that suggested it had last been used sometime in the previous decade and cleaned never. The front room contained a table, 2 chairs, a shelf of tools, and mechanical parts that had evidently migrated indoors during a winter and never migrated back out, and a coat hook bearing 3 identical canvas jackets that differed only in their degree of wear. There was a wood stove in good repair. There was a window that let in good light from the south. The bedroom she had been assigned contained a rope bed with a straw mattress, a blanket of moderate quality, a small table, and a nail in the wall where previous tenants, or perhaps Elias, in some rare domestic impulse, had hung a small mirror tarnished around the edges but functional. There was also a gap between the window frame and the wall where the chinking had crumbled away, perhaps 2 fingers wide, through which the outdoor air moved freely and with considerable enthusiasm. She noted all of this with the methodical attention of a woman who has decided that work is the available substitute for everything else. She tied on an apron, rolled up her sleeves, and started with the kitchen. The first week was a revelation in its own way. Not a comfortable revelation, but an honest one. She had been raised in a city household with a cook and a housekeeper, which meant that her practical knowledge of domestic work was theoretical in certain crucial respects. She knew in the abstract how bread was made. She had watched it made. The gap between watching and doing proved wider than she had anticipated, and her first 2 loaves emerged from the oven as objects that bore the geometric properties of bricks and shared something of their culinary properties as well. She stood in the kitchen and looked at them for a moment. Then she took them outside and fed them to the 2 chickens she had discovered living in a leaning coop behind the barn, and she went back inside and started again, this time with more attention paid to the amount of yeast and less to the speed of the process. Elias came in for supper that night at 2 minutes past 7 and found a meal on the table that was plain but edible. Salt pork and beans, cooked soft cornbread that was perhaps slightly denser than ideal, but unmistakably food and coffee that was hot and strong. He sat down and ate without comment. When he was finished, he pushed back from the table and said, "Coffee's good," and went to his room. Clara cleared the table and washed the dishes and stood at the window for a moment looking out at the dark land and the sky above it, which was, she had to admit, extraordinary. Unpolluted by the gas lamps of any city, the stars over Wyoming in the autumn of 1882 were a spectacle of such density and brilliance that it made you wonder briefly what you had thought the sky looked like before you had seen this. The Milky Way was not a suggestion, but a river white and vast and close enough that it seemed you might reach it if you had a ladder tall enough. She looked at it for a long time before she banked the stove and went to bed. This was the rhythm of those first weeks. She worked, he worked. They occupied the same structure and the same hours without occupying the same world. He ate what she cooked without complaint, which she chose to interpret not as approval, but as the absence of objection. And for now, the absence of objection was sufficient. She learned the kitchen. She reorganized the household by a system of her own devising, which she had some satisfaction in noting, produced immediately measurable improvements in efficiency. The right tools being in the right places when needed, the food stores properly sealed and inventoried, the daily tasks distributed across the day in a way that prevented the accumulation of exhaustion. She learned the chickens their particular personalities and hierarchies, the order in which they emerged from the coop each morning, the degree of offense they took at minor disruptions to their routine. She learned where Elias kept his tools and what each one was for. She learned the sound of the windmill in different wind conditions and what each variation meant. She learned that the sound of boots on the porch at a certain cadence meant he was tired, and the same sound at a different cadence meant something had gone wrong with the cattle or the fence, or some other element of the ranch's endless maintenance. She learned all of this the way she had always learned things, through careful observation and the patient accumulation of evidence, without asking for help and without admitting difficulty. What she did not do was allow herself to feel anything about Elias Voss, beyond the professional assessment of a woman cataloging her circumstances. He was efficient. He was fair in the sense that he did not demand more than was agreed, and did not take what was not offered. He left her the larger share of the wood on cold mornings, which might have been generosity, or might have been the calculation that a sick housekeeper was an inconvenience. He repaired the porch step that had rotted through without being asked, which might have been pride in his property, or might have been concern that she would fall through it. She catalogued each observation and withheld judgment, and kept the bolt on that interior door firmly in place. The work was hard in ways she had not fully understood when she was reading about the frontier in books, which presented it primarily as romance, as the courageous adventure of civilization imposed upon wilderness. The reality was that it was simply hard, physically demanding, in the accumulative way that wears you down, not through dramatic exertion, but through the relentless daily total of the lifting and carrying and scrubbing and hauling, and the weather that came through the walls, no matter how carefully you stuffed the gaps, and the loneliness that was not romantic, but was simply large and persistent, like the wind. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not, and she had learned years ago that the promises you make to yourself are the only ones that cannot be broken by someone else. She wrote in a small journal she kept under the straw mattress. Not letters she had no one to write to, and would not have written to her father if she were on fire, but observations. The quality of the light at different hours, the names she was giving the chickens, the way the mountains to the west caught the sunset and held it long after the valley had gone to shadow. The particular satisfaction of bread that rose correctly, and the particular dissatisfaction of discovering that satisfaction had to serve in the place of so many other things. By the end of the first month, she could make bread that was genuinely good. She noted this in her journal without excessive celebration. It was progress. Progress was what you made when you had nothing else. The leaves turned on the aspens along the creek that ran through the eastern edge of the property, turned in the way that Wyoming aspens turn all at once, and completely, a sudden declaration of gold against the brown and gray of the autumn landscape. And Clara walked out to the creek one afternoon when her work was done, and stood among them, and looked up through the trembling leaves at the sky, and felt for the first time since Philadelphia something that was not precisely grief or anger or the cold satisfaction of endurance, something quieter, something that had no name. She was ready to give it. She stood there for a long time. Then she walked back to the house and started supper. He did not speak to her much. She had noted this as a characteristic, rather than a verdict, the way you note that a particular landscape is dry rather than condemning it for its lack of water. He was a man of few words, and those few were deployed with careful economy transactions of information rather than conversation. Pass me that. Gate needs fixing on the south end. Storm coming might be 2 days. She answered in kind, matching his register neither more nor less, and the effect was of two people maintaining a complex piece of machinery together through the silent coordination of competence. What she had not expected, because she had not allowed herself to expect anything, was the day in the 4th week when she came in from hanging laundry to find that the gap in her bedroom window, the one where the outdoor air came through freely and with enthusiasm, had been filled. New chinking, still pale against the older material around it, fitted precisely into the space. Clean, careful. Done when she was outside, so she would not witness the doing of it. She stood in the doorway of her bedroom and looked at the repaired window for a moment. Then she went back to the kitchen and began the preparations for supper and did not mention it. She told herself it was property maintenance. A man maintained his structures. That was all. She believed this with some effort for several more weeks. The wooden comb appeared on a Tuesday. She knew it was Tuesday because she had developed the habit in the absence of any social calendar that might otherwise mark the passage of time of tracking the days with small notations in her journal. And Tuesday was the day she baked, the day the kitchen smelled of warm bread from mid-morning until the light shifted to afternoon gold, and she was at the table with flour on her hands when she noticed it sitting at the edge of the surface beside the small mirror, as though it had always been there, as though it had simply materialized out of the quiet air of the room while she was occupied elsewhere. It was carved from a pale wood she did not immediately recognize, smooth and carefully worked with teeth that were even and close set, and a back that had been shaped to fit the curve of a palm. Someone had taken considerable time with it. The teeth were not rough cut, but finished, each one tapered to a gentle point, and along the top edge of the back there was a small repeating pattern diamonds within diamonds, incised with a tool fine enough to suggest patience rather than haste. It was not elaborate. It was not trying to be beautiful in any showy sense, but it was made with care, and that care was visible in every line of it. Clara picked it up and turned it in her hands and stood very still in the doorway of her bedroom for a long moment. Then she set it back on the table, went to the kitchen, and punched down the risen bread dough with perhaps more force than was strictly necessary. She did not ask him about it at supper. He came in at 7:05 later than usual with a cut on the back of his left hand that he had wrapped in a piece of cloth and tied off himself, the kind of wound that came from wire, from fence work, and she noted it and set a plate in front of him and did not immediately comment. He ate. She poured his coffee. When she refilled her own cup and sat down across from him, which she had begun to do in the 3rd week, when the alternative eating standing at the counter alone, while he sat at the table alone, had seemed performatively absurd, she said, without looking directly at him, "You cut yourself." "Wire," he said, confirming what she had already known. "I have clean cloth and carbolic. You should let me look at it." He regarded her across the table with that still assessing expression. Then he extended his hand. She unwrapped it and examined the cut with the brisk competence of a woman who has decided that squeamishness is a luxury she cannot afford. It was a clean laceration, not deep enough to require more than careful cleaning and binding, and she cleaned it with the carbolic and wrapped it in fresh cloth and tied it off with the same practical efficiency. His hand was large and rough-palmed and warm, the kind of hand that has been worked hard for a long time, and she held it with the same detached attention she would have given a tool that needed repair, and was aware with a mild irritation at herself that she was holding it with something that was not entirely detachment. She released it and gathered the soiled cloth. "Thank you," he said. The words sounded slightly unused, as though they had been sitting in a drawer for a while. "It needs to stay clean," she said. "In a working environment, it will want checking in the morning." He nodded. She washed the cloth at the basin and hung it to dry and said without turning around, "I found the comb." The silence behind her had a different quality than their usual silence. She waited. "Cottonwood," he said after a moment. "Cuts clean." She turned around. He was looking at his coffee. "You made it yourself," she said. "Winters are long." A pause. "Store doesn't carry them." She looked at him across the kitchen, this man who spoke the way others conserved water in a drought, measuring each word against its necessity, and she felt something move in her chest that was dangerously close to the direction of the bolted door, and she chose not to examine it. "It's well made," she said with the same tone she used for any accurate assessment of quality. Then she dried her hands and said good night and went to her room. She lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the wind work its way around the corners of the house and the distant sound of the cattle settling for the night, and she thought about hands that built fences in the cold. And then came home and spent the remaining light-shaping cottonwood into something small and useful, and she thought about what it meant that he had not given it to her with any ceremony or explanation, had simply left it there, to be found. The giving entirely private, the acknowledgment left to her discretion. She reached out in the dark and picked up the comb from the small table and held it for a moment, feeling the smooth precision of the carved teeth, and then set it back down and told herself very firmly that a comb was a comb and a practical man provided practical things, and it meant nothing beyond the practical. She almost believed it. Winter came to Wyoming with the unapologetic commitment of a force that does not acknowledge alternatives. It did not arrive gradually. It arrived the way certain truths arrive all at once, complete and irrevocable. And what had been cold became something else entirely, something that had ambitions beyond mere temperature, that wanted to press through every wall and seal and garment, and remind you with considerable physical emphasis that your presence in this landscape was contingent and fragile, and dependent on preparation and luck and the structural integrity of the wood in your walls. The first real storm came in November, 3 days of wind and driving snow that reduced visibility to nothing and kept Elias working from the barn, making 2 trips a day through the white chaos to the house for meals and warmth arriving each time, with ice in his beard and cold radiating from his coat like a second weather system. Clara kept the wood stove burning through the nights, rising twice to feed it, waking in the blue dark pre-dawn to the sound of the wind and the particular deep silence that indicates heavy snowfall, a silence that is not quiet at all but dense, muffled, the world wrapped in something that swallows sound. On the second day of the storm, he came in at midday and stood at the door shedding snow, and she handed him a cup of coffee without being asked, and he wrapped both hands around it and stood by the stove and drank it without speaking. And she went back to the pot of stew that had been going since morning, and the kitchen was warm and the snow pressed against the windows. And outside the world was white and impassable, and inside there was heat, and the smell of food and the quiet that existed between them had changed its quality. She noticed from the silence of 2 strangers to something more like the silence of 2 people who are thinking separately but in the same room on purpose. She was not sure when that had happened. "Cattle are holding," he said when he had finished the coffee. "Good," she said. "East fence has a section down. Can't get to it until this breaks." He was quiet for a moment, watching the snow against the window. "Might lose some to drift." She noted the tightness around his eyes when he said it, the controlled expression of a man calculating losses he can neither prevent nor afford. "Will they shelter in the ravine?" she asked, because she had been listening over these weeks and had accumulated enough of the working vocabulary of the ranch to ask questions that were not naive. He looked at her with a slight shift in his expression, something that might have been reassessment. "Some will," he said. "Older ones know it." "Then the older ones will lead," she said with a certainty she mostly felt. He was quiet for a moment. "That's the hope," he said. He had a second cup of coffee and ate a bowl of the stew and went back out into the storm, and she watched him go through the window, the broad shape of him disappearing into the white. And she stirred the stew, and did not name what she was feeling, because to name it would be to acknowledge it, and to acknowledge it would require examining the bolted door, and she was not ready. The storm broke on the third day. Clara came out onto the porch in the early morning into a world that had been remade overnight. The valley lay under 2 feet of clean snow, the ridgelines above it sharpened against the sky as though cut with a blade, and the sky itself had the particular hard blue of high-altitude winter, a color with no softness or compromise in it, purely beautiful in the way that only utterly indifferent things can be. The aspens along the creek were bare now, but their white trunks against the snow made a pattern of extraordinary precision, like text in a language you almost understood. She stood on the porch in her coat, and her breath made clouds in the still air, and she looked at all of it, and felt the land enter her in some way that she could not precisely articulate, the enormous quiet of it, the scale that reduced everything human and small and painful to a proportionate size, and understood that she was becoming against all her original intentions attached to this place. That was the first loss of the winter. The second came in January. She had been in Drybone Valley for 4 months when Elias told her they needed to go to town for supplies. The flour was running low, the salt pork nearly gone, and there were items he needed for the spring work that could not wait. They left in the early morning, the wagon loaded with empty sacks, and a short list, the mare moving with the careful authority of an animal that knows ice and respects it. The road to town was 20 miles, and in winter conditions it took most of the morning. Drybone Valley in January was a different creature than Drybone Valley in September. The rawness of the new lumber had given way to a more weathered character, and the cold had driven the population indoors, so that the main street was quieter than it had been on her arrival, with only occasional figures moving between buildings with the purposeful hurry of people who know better than to stand still. The general store was warm and smelled of coffee and sawdust, and the proprietor, a round-faced man named Hobbs with a set of impressive side whiskers, greeted Elias with the comfortable familiarity of a long business relationship, and nodded at Clara with the cautious courtesy of someone who has heard something and isn't sure what to make of it. She went through her list methodically while Elias spoke with Hobbs about the things men speak about in hardware stores, the condition of the road, the prospects for the spring, the price of beef at the territorial railhead. She had moved to the dry goods section and was examining bolts of heavy cotton, calculating what she would need for the curtains she intended to make for the front room when she became aware that she was not alone in the aisle. There were 3 of them. She had noticed them when she and Elias first came in, the way you notice things at the edge of a room that register as requiring attention without immediately clarifying why. They were men in the indefinite range of age between 25 and 40, dressed in the practical clothing of working men, but with a quality of being at leisure in the middle of a working day that suggested their work was not the kind that happened in fields or barns. They had been drinking not heavily, but enough that the social filters were slightly porous. They stood near the stove at the back of the store, and they had been watching her, she realized, since she walked in. The one who spoke was the tallest of them, with a smile that had learned to do the surface movements of friendliness without the underlying structure that gives those movements meaning. He said something that was in its first sentence a compliment about her appearance, and in its second sentence a question about how a woman that fine ended up married to someone like Elias Voss. She set down the bolt of cotton and looked at him with the direct, clear attention of a woman who has made herself a promise about the kind of person she intends to be, and said, "Help you with something." The smile widened in a way that did not improve it. The other 2 moved to flank positions in the casual, practiced manner of men who had done this before. The tall one said something else, and then a third thing, and by the third thing the veneer of social convention had worn through entirely, and what was underneath was something uglier and more direct about what a woman alone at the back of a store might be persuaded to offer. Clara did not step back. She had stopped being the woman who stepped back. She opened her mouth to answer him with the specific, precise clarity of everything she thought about men who understood women as objects for their convenience. And it was at that exact moment that the door of the store opened, and the cold air came in, and it was followed by Elias. He had not seen it from the front. He had heard it or sensed it, the way a man who has lived in an environment long enough to know its normal frequencies can detect when something is running at the wrong pitch. He came around the end of the dry goods aisle and took in the configuration of the room in perhaps 2 seconds. What happened after that happened very quickly and was, in its way, an education. He did not say anything. He did not issue warnings or requests or ask anyone to reconsider. He crossed the distance between himself and the tall man in 3 strides, and the thing that happened next was neither prolonged nor theatrical. It was the application of force by a man who had spent years doing work that required him to understand how much force was necessary for a given task, and to apply precisely that amount without waste or excess. The tall man sat down on the floor beside the stove. His 2 companions made a collective assessment of the situation and arrived at a sound conclusion. Elias looked at them for a long moment with an expression that communicated, without the use of words, the full scope of what would occur if this was not the end of the matter. Then he turned away from them, the deliberate act of a man who has already moved on, and walked to where Clara was standing and said in his usual unhurried voice, "You find the cotton you needed." She looked at him. The red line of his earlier anger was still visible in the set of his jaw, but his voice was as even as if they had been discussing the weather, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not seeking praise or recognition or any acknowledgement whatsoever of what he had just done, as though it had been a matter of the same order as repairing a fence, a thing that needed doing and had been done. "Not yet," she said. He reached past her and took 2 bolts of the heavy cotton from the shelf and carried them to the counter. She followed him. Hobbs charged them for the cotton without comment, and the men by the stove remained where they were, very still and very quiet. And Clara and Elias loaded their supplies into the wagon and drove back out of Drybone Valley into the winter landscape with the same silence they had come in with, but the silence had changed. Again, shifted into a new register, and she was aware of him beside her in a way that was different from the way she had been aware of him before. He did not mention it on the drive home. Not the men, not the intervention, not any of it. He talked about the east fence and the state of the hay supply and what he expected the cattle prices to do in spring, and she listened and responded, and the miles unwound behind the mare, and the sky went from pale blue to the long gold of afternoon, and still he said nothing about what had happened. No performance of heroism, no demand for gratitude, no casting of himself as the protagonist of anything. It was the absence of performance, she realized, that was the most disarming thing about him. She thought about the window repaired in silence, the comb left without ceremony, the cup of coffee placed in her hand before she had asked for it on the 2nd day of the storm, the wood stove on the mornings she came downstairs to find it already banked and burning, which required someone to rise earlier than she did. Each of these things taken individually had an alternative explanation that she had readily provided. Together accumulated over months, they were beginning to resist the alternative explanations. She sat with this on the drive home and did not know what to do with it. That night after supper, when he had pushed back from the table and she had risen to clear the dishes, he said, still looking at his coffee cup, "Those men, Calhoun and his bunch, they've caused trouble before." A pause. "You shouldn't be in that store alone." She turned from the basin and looked at him. "I had not gone in alone. You were 10 feet away." 10 feet is far enough. "Then perhaps," she said carefully, "you might stay closer in town." He looked up at her then, and for a moment she saw something in his expression that was not the usual practiced opacity, something that had more temperature, more presence, and she held herself very still, the way you hold still when something rare and unpredictable is close enough to touch. "I'll stay closer," he said. She turned back to the dishes and washed them with the steady, careful attention of someone who is using her hands to anchor herself to the present moment, and when they were done, she dried them and put them away, and said good night in the same tone she always used, and went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time. The bolt on the interior door, she noticed, was still in place. But something was pressing against it now from the other side, something quiet and persistent and patient, and the wood of the door was beginning grain by grain in ways too small to measure, but too real to deny to yield. February was the cruelest month, in the way that months of extreme cold become cruel not through drama, but through relentlessness. The cold itself was almost normalized. What wore on the spirit was the smallness of the world. It imposed the ranch, the house, the barn, the paths between them beaten into the snow by daily use. The way the distances between a person and anything beyond this radius became theoretical. Clara read her poetry book through twice. She mended everything that could be mended. She began the curtains from the cotton she had bought, working at them in the evenings by the light of the oil lamp, and the work of sewing was meditative and permitted thinking which was both its value and its hazard. She thought about her father less than she had expected to. When she did think of him, it was with a clarity that was almost clinical, as though she were examining a specimen behind glass. A man shaped by his weaknesses into a man who sacrificed his daughter's life to preserve his own comfort. And she had nothing for him, not anger, not grief, both of which required a level of lingering expectation she had concluded she would not maintain. She had been dealt a hand. She was playing it. She thought more about what she was becoming. The woman who had boarded the train in Philadelphia had been built around a hollow space, the space left by love that had been consistently disappointed, and she had responded to that hollow space by constructing the most impenetrable interior fortifications she could manage. That architecture had served her. It had gotten her through the train journey, and the arrival, and the first terrible weeks of trying to find footing in a life she had not chosen. It had kept her functional and upright and competent, which was what survival required. But there was a cost to fortifications. The walls that kept things out also kept you in, and she was becoming aware in the long, reflective evenings of February, with the snow pressing at the windows and the oil lamp burning and the sound of his movement in the next room through the wall, that the hollow space was not perhaps as hollow as she had thought. Something was growing in it. Quietly, without her permission, in the way that certain hardy plants grow through concrete, by the patient and irresistible accumulation of small forces, something was growing. She finished the first curtain on a night when the wind outside had that particular quality of making the house feel, by contrast, like the last warm place on earth. She held it up to check the seam and the hem, running it through her hands, and then she heard from the front room an unusual sound. She went to the doorway. Elias was at the table, which he used in the evenings for whatever maintenance tasks required fine work, and in front of him was a small piece of cottonwood, and in his hands was a small, very sharp knife, and he was making something. She could not see what it was, not from where she stood, but she could see the quality of his attention, the way his large, rough hands moved with a precision that was at odds with everything about their appearance, and she stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking, watching him work in the lamplight. He looked up. She had the sensation of being caught doing something she should not have been doing, though she had merely been standing in a doorway in her own house. "Curtains done," she said. He looked at the length of fabric in her hands. "Good," I said. She went back to her room and picked up her journal and wrote, I think I may be in considerable difficulty." Then she closed the journal and blew out the lamp and lay in the dark and listened to the sound of the knife working against the wood through the wall, steady and quiet and patient, and the wind moving around the corners of the house, and far away the cattle settling in the barn. And she thought that February in Wyoming was the loneliest and the most unexpectedly full month she had ever lived. By the time March arrived, with its tentative suggestions of thaw, its mornings that no longer felt quite so committed to killing everything, Clara had finished all 4 curtains and hung them and reorganized the tool shelf in the front room and taught herself through considerable trial and error and one minor burn to make pie crust that was reliably short and flaky, and she had not named the thing growing in the hollow space. She had observed it with the same careful, non-committal attention she brought to everything in this new life. Noted its evidence, declined to draw conclusions, kept the bolt in place. But she was aware in the way that you become aware of spring before you can see it in the smell of the air, before the snow breaks in the particular quality of the light at a certain hour, that something was coming. Something was already quietly underway, and no amount of bolted doors would change the direction in which things were moving. She was not sure whether that frightened her or not. She was not sure she had the luxury of being frightened. She was 24 years old, and it was nearly spring, and she was alive, which was more than she had fully believed she would be when she boarded that train in Philadelphia in a coat of righteous determination and nothing else. She stood at the south window one afternoon in early March and looked out at the valley and watched the light move across the brown and white landscape, the way the shadow of a cloud crossed the ridge, and the ridge went darker and then lighter again, and she felt the land as a presence, enormous and patient and enduring. And she thought, not for the first time, that there were worse things to be in the world than here in this rough house with these 4 cotton curtains and this small carved comb on the table beside her mirror. She picked up the comb and ran it through her hair, feeling the smooth, careful precision of each tooth, and looked at herself in the tarnished mirror, and the woman who looked back at her was not the woman who had boarded the train in Philadelphia. That woman had been made of ice and good intentions. This woman was something else, still hard in the necessary places, but beginning in other places to be something more. Spring came to Drybone Valley the way grace comes to people who have stopped expecting it, without announcement, without ceremony, arriving simply in the quality of the morning light one day in late March, a warmth in it that had not been there the day before, soft and persistent, like a hand placed gently on the shoulder of a long winter. The snow did not disappear all at once, but retreated in stages, pulling back from the south-facing slopes, first revealing the brown grass beneath with the tentative quality of something that has been hidden and is not yet sure it is safe to be seen. Clara noticed it on a morning when she came out to feed the chickens and found that she did not need to hunch against the cold. She stood in the yard with the feed pan in her hands and turned her face to the east and felt the sun as a genuine presence rather than a distant and theoretical comfort. And she stayed there for a long moment with her eyes closed, feeling the warmth on her skin, and the chickens moved around her feet with their usual indignant commentary on the pace of breakfast service. Something in her unclenched. She had not known how tightly she had been holding herself against the winter until the winter began to release its hold on everything else, and the unclenching was involuntary and slightly startling, the way a hand cramps from sustained gripping and does not let you know it is cramped until you try to open it. Elias noticed the change in the land, the way he noticed everything about the land, which was to say, immediately and practically, his attention turning with the season toward the work that spring would bring. The fence sections that winter had damaged needed repair before the cattle drifted. The south field needed to be turned for whatever kitchen garden Clara might want. He had mentioned this one evening with the same matter-of-fact tone he used for ranch business, as though it had always been assumed she would have a garden, as though she had always been a permanent feature of this place, rather than a recent and reluctant installation. She had noted the assumption without commenting on it directly, but she had taken out her journal that evening and written a list of what she wanted to plant, and the list had been longer than strictly necessary, and she had allowed herself to notice that without apology. The thaw brought him closer to the house. The barn work that winter concentrated into long indoor hours now expanded into the broader acreage of the ranch, and he would come in at different times depending on what the day's work demanded. Sometimes mid-morning with dirt on his boots and a specific question about some piece of household inventory. He needed, sometimes not until well after dark, with the look of a man who has been in combat with the land all day and reached a satisfactory draw. She learned the vocabulary of his exhaustion, the particular set of his shoulders when the day had been merely hard versus the days when it had been hard in ways that cost something beyond the physical. On one of those harder evenings, she set a plate in front of him and poured his coffee, and sat down across the table and watched him eat for a moment before she said, "The south fence." He looked up. 3 sections down, posts rotted through at the base. All 3 can be repaired. 2. Third needs to be reset. He ate for a moment. "Takes time I don't have twice. Is there someone in town who could help?" He made a sound that was not quite dismissal, but contained the essential quality of it. "Calhoun's boys do that kind of labor when they can't find easier work." He set down his fork. "I'd rather set the post with my teeth." She had heard the name Calhoun with a new register since January had felt it land differently in her body than it had before, something tighter in her chest when it came up in conversation. She set this reaction aside with the same deliberate efficiency she applied to most things she was not ready to examine, and said, "What about the homesteader to the north, Brennan?" Elias looked at her with a slight recalibration of expression, the look she had come to recognize as the one that indicated she had said something he had not expected from her. She had been accumulating those looks, she realized, in the way that a person accumulates small recognitions, each one insufficient alone, but together constituting something that felt in its aggregate like being seen. "Brennan owes me half a day from last September," he said after a moment. "Then perhaps he would consider the debt paid," she said. He picked up his fork again. Something at the corner of his mouth shifted fractionally in the direction of what might have been on a face less committed to reserve a smile. "Perhaps he would," he said. She went to bed that night feeling obscurely that she had contributed something that mattered, and the feeling was warm enough that she chose not to interrogate it. The garden was a project she entered with the same methodical energy she had brought to the reorganization of the kitchen, the same commitment to competence as a substitute for things she could not allow herself to want. Elias turned the south field for her in an afternoon, the heavy work of breaking ground that had been left fallow, and she followed behind him with a rake and broke the clods and cleared the stones and began the business of understanding the soil. It was clay-heavy in places and sandy in others, and she worked it with compost from the kitchen heap she had been maintaining since November, mixing and turning, learning the field the way she had learned the house through patient physical attention. She planted in rows she measured with string precisely spaced, and the act of pressing seeds into the dark earth had a quality she had not anticipated, something ceremonial in it, the committing of small futures to uncertain ground. The act of a person who intends to be here when the thing grows. She understood kneeling in the turned soil in the April morning with dirt under her fingernails and the smell of the earth rich around her that she had stopped thinking of this place as temporary. She could not have named exactly when that had happened. Elias came to the fence of the garden one evening after supper and stood with his arms on the top rail looking at her work. She was staking the bean rows, driving the small stakes with a mallet, and she did not look up immediately when she heard him come. "Beans there," she said, indicating the row. "Squash along the south wall for the heat. Carrots and beets down the east side where the drainage runs." "You've done this before," he said. It was not quite a question. "No," she said, "but I read extensively and I pay attention." A pause. "You do," he said, and the way he said it was different from how he might have said it as simple confirmation of a fact. There was something in the timbre of it that made her drive the next stake with perhaps slightly more attention to the stake than was strictly required. She had been paying attention to him was the difficulty. She had been paying attention to him with an accumulating intimacy of detail that had crept past the boundary of functional observation and into territory she had not approved the crossing of. She knew the sound of his sleep through the wall, the way it changed when something was troubling him, more restless, turning at intervals, versus the deep, even rhythm of a man who has worked himself to the physical margin and gone over it into the uncomplicated darkness of real exhaustion. She knew the particular way he held his coffee cup in both hands on cold mornings, the way he tracked the cattle on the ridge with his eyes, when he thought no one was watching, counting them, accounting for them, the way a man counts the things he is responsible for. She knew that he had a book on the shelf in his room. She had seen it when she passed his open door, a worn copy of something she could not read the spine of, and that it was worn in the way of a book that has been read not once but many times, which told her something about him she had not expected. She knew the exact quality of the silence that meant he was comfortable versus the silence that meant he was withholding something. She had gathered all of this without intending to, and could not now ungather it. April moved toward May with the steady building momentum of a season that has found its confidence. The pasture greened with a gradual insistence, and the creek ran high with snowmelt, loud enough to hear from the house, and the mornings filled with the specific orchestra of birds returning to a place they understood better than any map. And the ranch shed its winter character and became something that looked in the long, golden light of May evenings like the kind of place that could sustain a life. Not just survive it, sustain it. She was hanging laundry on a morning in mid-May when she heard the horses. They came from the south road, 3 riders moving at a pace that was not casual, and she recognized Calhoun before she could have explained how something in the posture of the lead horse or the loose, self-certain arrangement of the man on it, and she felt the familiar tightening in her chest and turned toward the barn where she could hear Elias working. "Elias?" she called, and her voice came out steady, which pleased her. He came out of the barn with a wrench in his hand and saw the riders, and something in his face went very still in the way a landscape goes still before weather. Calhoun pulled up at the gate with the easy entitlement of a man who has decided in advance that he owns whatever he is standing in front of. He had 2 men with him she had not seen before, larger than the 2 from the store, and they had the quality of men chosen for a specific purpose. He leaned on his saddle horn and smiled the smile that had nothing underneath it and said, "Voss, good morning." "Calhoun," Elias said. He had not moved from the barn door. "Just riding through," Calhoun said, which was transparently false given that the ranch was not on any road to anywhere. His eyes moved to Clara at the laundry line. The smile shifted. "Mrs. Voss, you're looking well." She did not respond. "Heard you've been having some fence trouble," Calhoun said, returning his attention to Elias. "Tough spring for it. Lot of posts down across the valley." A pause that had a specific weight to it. Man alone can only do so much. "I manage," Elias said. "I imagine you do." Calhoun glanced around the yard with the appraising leisure of a man taking an inventory of something he expects to own eventually. "Beautiful piece of land you've got here, Voss. Good water, good pasture. Man I know has been looking at land in this valley. Generous offer if you were inclined." "I'm not," Elias said. The silence that followed was the kind that has calculations running through it. "Well," Calhoun said pleasantly, "offer stands." He looked once more at Clara, and the quality of the look was a kind of statement, A deliberate communication of contempt that was more chilling for being wordless, and then he turned his horse, and the three of them rode back the way they had come. Elias watched them until they were out of sight. Clara watched him watch them. "He wants the land," she said. "He wants a lot of things," Elias said, and the way he said it, flat and precise, told her that this was not the first time Calhoun had come with offers, and that the offers had been getting progressively less like offers. "What kind of man is he?" she said. Not a question exactly, an opening. Elias turned the wrench in his hands. "The kind," he said, "that when something belongs to someone else, he finds reasons why it shouldn't." He looked at her directly. "You stay near the house when I'm in the back pasture." She considered whether to argue this on principle, and concluded that principle could accommodate practicality without surrendering its ground. "All right," she said. He went back into the barn. She went back to the laundry and hung the remaining pieces with the steady, efficient movements of a woman who is doing one thing with her hands and an entirely different thing with the rest of her, and when the basket was empty, she stood for a moment looking at the south road. Empty now, and felt something she could only call the awareness of being in a country where safety was not a given, but a thing that required tending, like the garden, like the fence, like everything out here that mattered. It was in this context, in the heightened alertness of those weeks after Calhoun's visit, that the thing she had refused to name became impossible to continue not naming. It happened gradually, and then all at once, the way certain processes work, ice melting at the imperceptible molecular level until the moment when the whole surface simply gives. The moment itself was undramatic, which seemed appropriate, given that everything real between them had always been undramatic. It was an evening in late May, warm enough that they had left the front door open the first time all year that the weather permitted such a thing, and the air coming through was soft, and smelled of the grass and the creek, and something blooming somewhere on the hillside, and the light through the open door was the deep amber of a long spring evening. Clara was sewing, finishing the last of a repair to his working shirt. The third button had given up from repeated strain, and she had replaced the others preemptively, since she was already at it. He was at the table with some papers, the ranch accounts presumably, though he did not discuss the finances with her, another item on the long list of things they had not yet crossed into. She looked up from the shirt, and he was already looking at her. It was not the first time she had looked up to find him watching her. She had catalogued these instances with the same careful non-commitment she brought to everything. Finding explanations, men looked at things in their houses. It was natural. It was habit. It was nothing. But the look on his face in the amber light of this particular evening did not have the quality of habit or of nothing. It had the quality of a man who has been looking at something for a long time and has finally, in an unguarded moment, let that looking be visible. She held his gaze for a moment without the usual defenses assembled. Then she looked back down at the shirt and set the last stitch and bit the thread and said, her voice very level, "This button is a better match than the original. The original was brass and these are bone, but the size is correct." A pause. "Thank you," he said. She folded the shirt and set it on the arm of the chair beside her and picked up her sewing basket and said without looking at him, "You should let me look at the accounts." A silence. "I managed my father's household accounts for 3 years, she said. "I am competent with figures." Another silence, longer. She waited with the patience she had developed over these months, the patience of a woman who has learned that silence is not refusal, that men like Elias spoke in their own time and not before it. "All right," he said. She looked up. He was still watching her with that expression that had no armor in it, and she looked back at him for a moment, and the door in her chest, the heavy one, with the bolt that she had slid home on a westbound train in September, was not open, not yet, but the bolt had moved, She could feel it had moved fractionally in a way that she did not try to push back. She picked up the sewing basket and said good night, and went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed in the warm spring dark, with the window open and the sound of the creek coming through it, and she thought about bolts and doors and the difference between keeping yourself safe and keeping yourself from everything, which were not the same thing, and had perhaps never been the same thing, and she had perhaps been confusing them since Philadelphia. Her journal entry that night was 3 words. She did not write what she was feeling. She wrote what she knew, which was the only honest accounting she had. She wrote, "I trust him." She stared at those 3 words for a long time. Then she closed the journal and lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling, and the warm May air moved through the window, and somewhere outside a nighthawk called. And the sound was wild and clean and free, and she let herself lie there in the dark without armor, just for a moment, just long enough to know what it felt like, and what it felt like was not as terrifying as she had imagined. It felt like something beginning. The following weeks held a quality that she would try later to find language for, and would conclude that ordinary language was not equipped for it, that what she would need was the language of seasons of things that happen gradually, and then suddenly of ground warming from the inside out, until the surface simply swallows. They moved differently around each other, nothing declared, nothing articulated, but the geometry of their daily life had shifted in some axis that changed how every point related to every other point. He came in at midday sometimes now and did not immediately go back out, sat for a moment at the table with his coffee, and she sat across from him, and they talked about things that were not the fence or the cattle, about the book on his shelf, which turned out to be a history of the Geological Survey of the Territories. A revelation that she had found unexpectedly charming about a passage in her poetry book that she had read aloud one evening with the tentative quality of a woman offering something that matters and not knowing how it will be received, and he had listened to the whole poem in complete stillness and then said, "Read that one again," in a voice that was quieter than usual, and she had. She had let herself feel it in the evenings, the warmth of a life that was building itself around her with the patient inevitability of something that had been true longer than she had been willing to admit. She let herself notice how the house felt different with the curtains on the windows, with the garden growing outside, with his boots at the door and her comb on the table, and both of them in their rooms through the wall at night, the thin barrier of timber that was less and less like a division, and more like the simple shared wall of a house that contained 2 people who had chosen in their different ways to be there. She let herself feel it with the careful provisional quality of someone who has been burned and knows that feeling is a risk and takes the risk anyway, because the alternative is a life behind glass observed but never entered, and she had decided somewhere in the long winter of learning who she was in this place that she was not willing to live that way. She was not willing to live that way. She had made herself a promise on the train. She had promised she would not give herself to anyone who had not earned it. She looked at the comb on her table. She looked at the window with its new chinking solid against any weather. She looked at the curtains she had sewn herself, framing a view of the valley that she had come to love with a ferocity that still surprised her. She thought about a man who repaired things quietly, who carved patience into cottonwood, who placed himself between her and danger without making anything of it, who had asked her to read the poem again. She thought about trust. It was in this state of careful, provisional opening of a heart that has begun to believe in the direction it is moving that she found the trunk. It was a Saturday in early June, the kind of morning that Wyoming offers in early summer as a kind of apology for all the months it has spent trying to kill you, warm and clear and with the smell of the flowering sage drifting up from the hillside. She was reorganizing the storage corner of the front room, making space for the equipment Elias would need to bring in from the barn before the summer heat made certain repairs impractical, and she pulled out a wooden trunk she had noticed before, but never opened, old and banded in iron, sitting under a canvas that had accumulated the passive archaeology of several seasons. She lifted the canvas. She tried the lid, and it opened without resistance. Inside were papers, mostly ranch documents, land filings, cattle records, the accumulated bureaucratic evidence of a man claiming his place in the world through the official channels that such places required. She was going to close, it was already reaching for the lid when she saw the letters. They were tied with kitchen string, a small bundle of perhaps 6 envelopes, and the handwriting on the top one was a handwriting she recognized. She had spent 24 years reading documents written in that hand account, ledgers, household instructions, notes of correction delivered without softness. She recognized her father's handwriting the way you recognize a scar. Her hand moved to the bundle before her mind had finished the sentence it was composing about why she should close the trunk and replace the canvas and walk away. She untied the string. She read the letters standing in the front room in the morning light, and the morning light did not change. The sage still bloomed on the hillside. The garden grew in patient rows. Outside the window, the house was entirely the same house it had been 2 minutes before, and Clara stood in the middle of all this unchanged reality and read the words her father had written about her and felt each sentence enter her with the precision of something designed for exactly this purpose. She is stubborn. She is quiet. She does not know how to please a man. She has never been easy to manage, and I confess I am at my limit. Take her at half price, man, and take her out of my sight. You will be doing us both a service. She read this twice. The second reading was not for comprehension. It was the way you press on a bruise to determine the exact shape of the damage. Then she found Elias's reply. She had told herself in the 2 minutes between finding the letters and reading them that she was a woman who could manage the truth about her father. She had known most of that truth already, had understood it on the day it was delivered in the study behind the mahogany desk, and she had processed it with the cold efficiency she had built herself around, and she had survived it. She had not told herself anything to prepare for what Elias had written. I don't need a beauty. I don't need sentiment or a woman who requires tending like a hothouse flower. What I need is practical, a woman capable of hard work, capable of silence, capable of holding her end of a difficult life without flinching and without complaint. If this girl is as undemanding as you say, put her on the train. A mule with sense is worth more out here than a thoroughbred that can't work. The room was very quiet. Clara read the letter again, not to find a different meaning in it. She had understood it with perfect clarity the first time, but because there was something in her that needed the full account of what she was dealing with, needed to read the exact words Elias Voss had written about her before she had been anything more than a description in a letter, a transaction, a mule with sense to hold a piece of land. Her hands were steady. She noted this with the distant observer quality that sometimes comes in the first moments after damage, the shock that precedes pain. She folded the letters precisely along their original creases and retied the string with the same knot it had come in and placed them back in the trunk exactly as she had found them and replaced the canvas and stood up. She looked at the room, the curtains on the windows, the tool shelf she had organized, the table where they sat in the evenings, and she had read poetry aloud, and he had asked her to read the poem again. She thought about trust. She thought about the 3 words she had written in her journal. She thought about what it meant that he had seen the words her father wrote about her, had read them, had agreed with their valuation, had brought her out here, knowing the exact price at which she had been discarded, and had proceeded to treat her for months and months with a consideration she had begun to allow herself to believe was something other than what the letter said it was. Maintenance, she thought. You maintain a tool that is performing well. You repair the window. You carve a comb. You make sure the mule is not too cold, not too hungry, not harassed in the general store by men who might damage the property. The thought was not fair. She knew, even as she thought it, that it was not fair. But fairness was not available to her in this moment, and what was available was the bone-deep cellular certainty that she had done this before, had believed in the warmth of someone who held the power over her life, and she would not do it again. She went to her room. She pulled her leather trunk from under the bed. She began to pack with the same deliberate, methodical efficiency with which she had unpacked it 8 months ago in this room that smelled of new wood and prairie wind. The sensible dresses, the poetry book, the journal. She packed these things with the focused attention of a woman who is using her hands to enforce a decision that the rest of her is not entirely in agreement with, but the rest of her had been wrong before, and she could not afford to let it be wrong again. She put the comb in last. She looked at it for a moment where it lay in the trunk among her things, the pale cottonwood smooth in the filtered light, the patient diamonds along the back. Then she closed the lid. Outside she could hear the mare moving in the paddock and the sound of the creek, and somewhere on the hillside the meadowlarks that had come back with the spring and claimed the territory above the ranch as their own. The garden was out there in its rows, the beans beginning to climb their stakes, the squash spreading its large preliminary leaves along the south wall. All of it right there through the window in the June morning light. She picked up her trunk and carried it to the front door. She set the trunk on the porch and stood for a moment in the doorway with her hand on the frame, looking out at the yard, the wagon, the paddock where the mare stood in the afternoon light with her head slightly lowered, dozing in the warmth with the particular contentment of an animal that has found its place in the world and made peace with it. Clara looked at none of this. She was looking at the road south the 20 miles back to Drybone Valley, and whatever came after Drybone Valley, a stage line, a train some direction that was not here. She had approximately $4 in the small purse she kept in the interior pocket of her coat money. She had put aside from the household budget in the careful private way of a woman who has learned that having no resources of your own is a form of captivity even when the captivity is not announced as such. She did not know whether $4 would get her far enough. She knew it would get her farther than the porch. She stepped off the porch and took the handle of the trunk. The wagon was there. The horse would be theft, and she was not a thief, but the wagon she could arguably claim some portion of given 8 months of labor that had never been compensated beyond room and board. Given the specific terms of an arrangement that had been purchased at half price, with the understanding that she was a mule and not a woman, given all of that, she thought the wagon was the least of what was owed. She had the trunk halfway to the wagon when she heard his boots on the ground behind the barn coming around the corner, and she kept walking because stopping would be worse than continuing, and she had made a decision and she intended to hold it. "Clara!" She stopped, not because he said her name with anything dramatic in it. He said it the way he said everything, level, unhurried, one word carrying whatever it was carrying in the specific quality of its delivery, rather than in any flourish of expression. But it was the first time he had said her name, she realized, standing very still with the trunk handle in her hand and her back to him. 8 months of living under the same roof, and he had called her nothing, addressed her as the subject of sentences that began with "you." And this was the first time he had said her name, and she hated that it affected her, and was affected by it anyway. She turned around. He was standing at the corner of the barn, the afternoon light behind him, and he looked at her trunk and then at her face. And his expression went through something she had not seen on it before, a rapid sequence of things moving beneath the surface. In the geological way, his expressions always moved, but faster now, less controlled. "You found them," he said. It was not a question. The flatness of it told her he had known this moment was possible, had perhaps known since the day she arrived, and moved through this house with her systematic attention to everything in it, that one day she would find the trunk and read what was inside. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The mare shifted in the paddock. A meadowlark called from the hillside with the bright, indifferent beauty of a creature that lives entirely outside human grief. "Clara," he said again, and this time there was something in the words she did not want to hear, something that was not excuse or justification, but was something more difficult, something that asked her to stay in one place long enough to receive it. "Don't," she said. "I need to say something." "You said it," she said, and her voice was level and precise, and she was proud of it the way you are proud of a wall that holds. You said it 9 months ago in a letter to my father. I don't need you to say it again with different words." His jaw tightened. Not in anger, she understood his face well enough now to know the difference, not in anger, but in the particular strain of a man who is trying to find the right door into a room he needs to enter, and finding every door locked. "What I wrote," he said slowly, "was the truth of what I thought I needed. Before." "Before what?" she said. "Before you." The words landed in the air between them and sat there in the June light, plain and insufficient and entirely too late, and Clara felt them hit the wall she was maintaining and felt the wall hold and was grateful for it and devastated by it in equal measure. "A mule," she said. "That's the word you used. A mule with sense." His face did something then that she had never seen it do. Something cracked in the careful, composed surface of it, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible to someone who had not spent 8 months learning every subtle inflection of this face, but visible to her the way hairline fractures are visible to the person who made them. "Yes," he said, "I used that word. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I didn't, or that it meant something other than it meant." He looked at her with the direct, unblinking attention of a man who has decided that honesty, however costly, is the only currency he has left. "I wrote that letter to a man who was selling his daughter like livestock. I wrote it in the language he was using because that was the transaction he had made it into. That was wrong. The language was wrong, and I knew it was wrong when I wrote it. And I wrote it anyway because I needed the land held, and I told myself the rest of it would work itself out." "And did it," she said, "work itself out?" "No," he said. "You did. You worked. Every day since September you worked, and you learned, and you held this place up, and you never once asked me for a single thing that wasn't practical, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, I stopped seeing an arrangement and started seeing you. And I don't know when that happened, but it happened, and now you're standing there with your trunk, and I am asking you not to go." The meadowlark called again. Clara stood with the trunk handle in her hand and looked at him across the yard, and felt the wall holding, and felt what it was holding against, and understood with the terrible clarity that comes to people who have trained themselves to see things accurately, that both were real. The letter was real. What he had just said was also real. Both could be true simultaneously, and the presence of one did not negate the other, and that was perhaps the most difficult thing she had ever been asked to hold. "You knew," she said, "when I stepped off that train. You already knew what he had written about me." "Yes." "And you looked at me on that platform, and you saw what he had described." A long pause. "I saw a woman who was holding herself together with both hands and refusing to let anyone see the cost of it," he said. "I saw that before I saw anything else." She had not expected that. She had prepared for several versions of this conversation, and not that one. And the fact that she had not prepared for it meant it found her without the relevant defenses in place, and went in clean the way an accurate thing does when it is said plainly. She set the trunk down, not because she had decided anything. She set it down because her arm was tired and because she needed both hands free for the next part of whatever this was, and putting down the trunk was not the same as putting down what she had decided, and she was going to hold on to that distinction. "I read every letter," she said, All 6 of them, I know. He called me stubborn. You are, Elias said, and there was something in his voice, not humor exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that recognized the word as a description and not a verdict. You are the most stubborn person I have ever encountered, and I say that as a man who has spent 8 years in an argument with this land, and neither of us has won yet. She looked at him. Against every intention she had arrived in this yard with, she felt something move in her that was not the controlled, catalogued responses of a woman managing her circumstances, but something older and less manageable, something that had been building in the space behind the bolted door. Since the first morning she had stood on this porch and looked at the enormous sky and felt the land enter her in a way that could not be taken back. What you wrote about the Homestead Act, she said, needing someone to fulfill the legal requirements. Was that true? Yes. And what you wrote about not needing love, not needing beauty. Was that true? He considered this with the honesty she had come to understand was not coldness, but its opposite, a refusal to give her anything that was not real. It was true of the man who wrote it, he said. I'm not sure it's true of the man standing here. The afternoon light moved across the yard between them, and the shadows lengthened by a fraction, and the mare raised her head in the paddock and looked at nothing in particular with the calm authority of an animal whose universe is organized around simpler and more reliable principles than the ones currently operating in the yard. Clara looked at the trunk at her feet. She looked at the road south. She looked at the man standing at the corner of his barn, with no armor on his face for the first time in 8 months, holding nothing back and offering nothing except the unembellished fact of what he was, which was a man who had been wrong and knew it, and was not pretending otherwise. She thought about the woman she had been on the train, the promises she had made herself in the dark with the wheels turning beneath her. Trust had to be earned. That was what she had promised, slowly, and at considerable cost. She thought about what 8 months of daily evidence looked like when you laid it out honestly, not the letter. The months, the window, the comb, the coffee on the second day of the storm, the way he had placed himself in front of her in the store and walked away without making anything of it, the evenings at the table with the lamp burning between them. The poem read twice. She bent down and picked up the trunk. She carried it back to the porch. She did not look at him as she passed, because she was not ready for him to see her face, which was doing things she had not authorized it to do, and she climbed the steps and set the trunk inside the door and stood with her back to the yard. For a moment her hand on the doorframe in the same position she had occupied an hour ago when she was leaving. I'm not forgiving the letter, she said to the interior of the house. She heard him behind her, not close, giving her the distance she needed. I'm not asking you to, he said. I'm staying because of 8 months, she said, not because of one conversation in a yard. That's fair, he said, and I will be looking at those accounts, she said. A pause. Yes, he said, you will. She stood in the doorway for another moment, and then she went inside and put her trunk back under the bed and took the comb out and set it on the table, beside the mirror, and looked at herself in the tarnished glass for a long time. At the woman looking back at her who was not forgiving and was not naive and was not defeated, and who had, against every original intention, decided to stay in a place that had become somewhere in the long arc of winter into spring unreasonably, irrevocably hers. She did not write in her journal that evening. Some things were too complicated for 3 words, and she had not yet found the longer version. The days that followed had a quality of altered arrangement, the same elements of their life rearranged into a slightly different configuration by what had passed between them in the yard, nothing declared, nothing resolved with the finality that resolutions in books always seem to achieve. But something adjusted at the fundamental level where adjustments actually matter. He spoke more, not dramatically more, He was not transformed overnight into a man who had discovered the pleasures of conversation, but more. And the more was different in its quality, less transactional, more like a man who had decided that the investment of words was not a loss. She spoke more too. She let herself ask questions she had withheld about the land, its history. Before him, the family he had come from, the years he had spent getting to this particular parcel of Wyoming territory with the particular ferocity of intention that had driven him to send a letter to a man in Philadelphia looking for a wife he could work alongside rather than tend. He answered these questions with the same careful honesty he had offered in the yard, not telling her what he thought she wanted to hear, but telling her what was true, which she had come to understand was his form of respect. He had come from Missouri, the third son of a farming family that had too many sons for the land it had to divide among them. He had been 19 when he came west, had worked cattle drives for 6 years before filing his homestead claim, had built the barn first and the house second, and had lived in the barn for a winter while the house went up timber by timber in whatever time was left after the work of keeping the cattle alive through a Wyoming winter which left very little. He had been alone on this land for 4 years when he wrote the letter, and alone was a thing he had managed and would not complain about. But the act required what it required, and the practical math of holding land long-term required a partner, and there was no soft version of that calculation that made it more or less than what it was. Was there anyone, she asked one evening carefully, before the letter? He was quiet for a moment. A woman in Laramie, he said. 3 years before I filed. She had more sense than to follow me out here. He looked at his coffee. I understood it later, when I understood what out here actually asked of a person. And you thought, Clara said, that a woman who had no choice but to come would stay where a woman with a choice would not. He met her eyes. I thought a woman who was already proving she could manage under duress was more likely to endure what needed enduring. A pause. I was thinking practically. You were always thinking practically, she said without heat. Yes, he said. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight. And now, she said. He looked back at her for a long moment, the way he looked at the land, sometimes the way you look at something you have understood for a while, but have been cautious about naming, because naming it makes it real, and real things can be lost. Now, he said, I am thinking about considerably more than practically. She felt the warmth of that move through her with a completeness she did not try to diminish or redirect. Let it be what it was. Let herself have it, and the bolt on the interior door, which had been loosening by increments since the first morning. She woke in this house, gave one final quiet turn, and was no longer a bolt at all, but simply a door standing open. June deepened into a summer that had its own demands, a drought that came in the second week of July and dried the creek to a quarter of its spring volume, requiring Elias to haul water to the cattle on the far pasture every second day. Brutal work in the heat, coming home in the evenings coated in dust, and wrung out in the way of a man who has given the day everything it asked for, and the day asked for considerable. Clara kept the household running with the efficiency she had built over months, kept cold water in the larder for when he came in, kept supper ready without making him wait for. It kept the garden alive with careful, targeted watering that prioritized the deep-rooted plants, the carrots and beets, over the squash and beans that could better endure. The garden was a daily conversation she had with the earth, a negotiation, this much water, this much attention, this much patience, in exchange for this much life. She found she was thinking about it the way she thought about most things she cared about, with a sustained background awareness, the way part of her mind was always tracking the condition of the soil and the progress of the bean vines up their stakes and the color of the squash leaves that would tell her if they needed more or less of something. She was in the garden on an afternoon in late July, kneeling between the carrot rows with her hands in the earth, when she heard the horses on the south road, and the sound was wrong from the first moment, not the rhythmic pace of travelers with a destination and a route, but the spread-out circling pattern of men who are positioning themselves. She stood up. There were 6 of them this time. Calhoun in front, and 5 men spread in a loose arc behind him, and 2 of the 5 were carrying rifles across their saddles in the particular casual way that means the rifles are meant to be noticed. They came through the gate without pausing, without the performance of courtesy that Calhoun had maintained in May, and that absence told Clara more than anything else about what kind of call this was. Elias came out of the barn. He had heard them. She could see it in the way he moved, the specific quality of his readiness that she recognized. Now the body of a man who has been waiting for something and is not surprised that it has arrived. Calhoun pulled up in the yard and looked between them with the satisfied expression of a man who has done his arithmetic and likes the sum. "Voss," he said, "we're going to settle this today." "Nothing to settle," Elias said. "I disagree." Calhoun reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "Bought your note from the Territorial Bank last Tuesday. You're 4 months behind on the loan that financed your last cattle purchase. Under the terms, the land is security." He unfolded the paper and looked at it with theatrical attention. "I'm here to discuss your options." Clara watched Elias absorb this. She watched him absorb it the way he absorbed everything, without visible flinching, taking the information in and processing it with a contained, practical assessment of a man who has survived this land by knowing what he actually has and what he does not. He had not told her about the loan. She filed this away not with anger, but with the understanding that there were still rooms in this man she had not been shown, and that some of them contained difficulties he had been managing alone, in the old habit of a man who had been alone a long time. "How much?" he said. Calhoun named a figure. Clara did the arithmetic from what she had been learning about the ranch accounts in the past weeks, and understood that the figure was real, that it was a real and serious number, and that the cattle operation had been running against this debt all year. The spring sale proceeds going to operating costs rather than principal, the note accumulating against the prospects of a better year that the drought had now complicated. "I'll have it by October," Elias said. "You'll have part of it by October," Calhoun said pleasantly. "In a drought year, with current beef prices." He let this sit for a moment. "My offer stands. The one I made you in May. I buy the land at a fair price. You walk away clean, no debt." His eyes moved to Clara with the particular quality she had learned to read accurately, not attraction, but possession, the way a man looks at something he has decided belongs in his inventory. The lady, too, of course, is free to make her own arrangements. The yard was very quiet. Clara felt something happen in her body that she recognized as the same thing that had happened in the general store there in January. The cold, precise, clarifying anger of a woman who has been looked at as a category rather than a person one too many times. And it was the same anger that had driven her down the train platform and out to the wagon and back inside with the trunk, when every other instinct said, "Flee." It was the anger that had kept her upright through everything, and it was entirely available to her now. She walked out of the garden and into the yard. She stopped beside Elias, and she looked at Calhoun with the direct, clear, unembellished attention of a woman who has decided that she is done with being managed and done with being overlooked and done with standing behind anything. "The note," she said. "What are the precise terms for cure?" Calhoun looked at her with the mildly surprised expression of a man who has not expected the furniture to speak. "Beg your pardon. The loan note," she said. "What are the terms under which a defaulting party may cure the delinquency and maintain the security?" She said it with the specific vocabulary of someone who has been reading contracts because she had been, because she had found the original loan documents in the accounts and had spent an evening with them working through the language, until she understood it. Most territorial bank instruments allow a cure period of 30 days from formal notice of default. Has formal notice been issued? A silence. Calhoun looked at her. He looked at Elias. Elias was looking at Clara with an expression she had never seen on his face before, that she would spend a long time later trying to name accurately, and the closest she could get was the look of a man who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just felt another pair of hands take part of the weight. The notice, Clara said again, was formal and written and served in the required manner. Calhoun refolded the paper with slightly less performance than he had unfolded it. "You'll have your 30 days, he said. His voice had lost the pleasant quality, and what was underneath was less patient. "But the arithmetic doesn't change, Mrs. Voss. You can't cure what you can't pay." "The arithmetic is our concern," she said. "Good afternoon." It was said with the finality of a woman closing a door, and it was said in a tone that had inherited from somewhere, perhaps from the same place her stubbornness had come, from the specific authority of a person who knows the ground they are standing on and will not be moved from it. Calhoun held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then he turned his horse, and the 5 men turned with him, and they rode back through the gate and out onto the south road, and the sound of them diminished into the afternoon. Clara stood in the yard until they were gone. Then she turned to Elias and said, "You should have told me about the loan." "Yes," he said. "I have been looking at those accounts for 3 weeks, and the note was not in what you showed me." "No," he said, "it was not." She looked at him. "Is there anything else?" He was quiet for a moment, with the particular quality of a man taking an honest inventory. "The roof on the north section of the barn needs replacing before winter. I've been managing it with patching, but it needs replacing." He paused. "And the hay yield is going to be short because of the drought. I'll need to buy supplemental feed for winter, which I don't currently have the cash for." "All right," she said. "Tell me the numbers." "Clara." "All of them," she said. "Every number. Tonight after supper. I want all of it on the table." He looked at her for a long moment with that expression that was still too large for her to fully name. "All right," he said quietly. She nodded and went back to the garden and knelt between the carrot rows and put her hands in the earth and held them there for a moment, pressing her palms flat against the soil, feeling its heat and its solidity and the faint, persistent life of it, and she breathed deliberately and completely, and told herself that 30 days was 30 days, and that she had the accounts, and she would find a number, and they would find a way. That night after supper they sat at the table with every document spread between them, and he told her all of it, every number, and she listened and calculated and asked questions, and he answered them. And they sat together in the lamplight, long after the oil should have been saved, 2 people working the same problem from the same side of the table. And at some point in the late hours, she looked up from the papers and found him watching her with the lamp between them. And she did not look away this time, and neither did he, and the open door between them held. And the night held, and the land outside held its enormous patient breath. She had worked out a plan by midnight. It required writing to the Stockmen's Association in Cheyenne about advance contracts on the fall cattle sale, required renegotiating the feed arrangement with Hobbs in town, required the careful sequencing of every available dollar across the 30-day window. It was possible. It was not comfortable or certain, but it was possible. And possible was what you worked with when certain was not available. She told him so. He looked at her plan in the lamplight, reading it carefully, and she watched him read it, and saw the moment he found the critical number, the one that made the difference, and she watched his expression when he found it. "This works," he said. "It might work," she said, "if the cattle prices hold and if Hobbs agrees to the new terms and if the Cheyenne contract comes through. But it might work. It might." He looked at her across the papers and the lamp with its low, warm light, and he said in the voice he used for things that cost him something to say, I don't know what I would do." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. She gathered the papers into their order and said, "You would manage. You always manage." She paused. "But you don't have to manage alone anymore." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the summer night moved around the house with its dark and its stars and its persistent wind, and the cattle were quiet on the far pasture, and the garden held its rows of growing things in the dark, patient and alive, waiting for morning. "No," he said finally, very quietly. "I don't?" She blew out the lamp, and they said good night in the dark, and she went to her room and lay in the warm summer dark and listened to the ranch breathe around her and felt the ground under everything solid and real. The ground she had learned and tended and planted and fought for across these months, the ground that was hers now in every way that mattered, and she thought that 30 days was a short time and a long time depending on what you did with it, and she intended to do everything with it. She was almost asleep when she heard very faintly through the wall between them the sound of him exhaling slowly, the particular exhale of a man who has been holding something for a long time and has at last, in the privacy of the dark, let it go. She closed her eyes. Outside, beyond the walls of the house, beyond the garden and the barn and the paddock and the pasture, the land lay under the summer stars in its ancient and unconditional way, holding everything up, asking nothing except endurance, offering nothing except the chance to stay. The letter from the Cheyenne Stockmen's Association arrived on a Thursday 9 days into the 30 that Calhoun had given them. Clara was at the table with the accounts when she heard the rider on the South Road, the particular unhurried pace of the postal rider who came through Drybone Valley twice a week and continued out to the outlying ranches when there was something to deliver. She went to the door, and he handed her a single envelope and tipped his hat and turned back the way he had come, and she stood on the porch and looked at the return address and felt something tighten in her chest. That was not quite hope and not quite fear, but occupied the same territory as both. She did not open it alone. She waited until she heard Elias come in from the north pasture, earlier than usual, and she set the envelope on the table between them, and he looked at it, and then at her, and she said, "I haven't opened it." He picked it up and looked at the return address and set it back down and looked at her again, and there was something in the exchange that was entirely without words and entirely clear, two people on the same side of a thing sharing the weight of whatever the answer was. "Open it," she said. He did. He read it once, and then he set it flat on the table and turned it so she could read it, and she read it, and the number in the contract offer was not everything they needed, and was not nothing. It was enough combined with what Hobbs had agreed to, combined with the careful sequencing she had mapped across the 30 days to make the arithmetic work. Not comfortably, not with anything left over, but work. She looked up. He was watching her with the lamp between them in the early evening light, and he said, "It's enough." "It's enough," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said with the direct simplicity of a man who has decided that the time for withholding has passed, "I don't know another person who could have done what you did with those numbers." She looked at him across the table. "You would have found a way." "Not this way," he said. "Not in 30 days. She picked up the letter and folded it along its crease and set it with the other documents in the order she had established for the accounts, the order that had been her first real act of claiming something in this house, and she said, "We should write back tonight. The contracts will need to be signed before the end of the week." "Yes," he said, "and tomorrow I need to go over the hay numbers again. If we can find 2 more tons at a reasonable price before September, we'll have more margin for error." "I'll ask Brennan," he said. "He had a good cut on the north field." She nodded and picked up her pen, and they spent the remainder of the evening writing the contract response, she cheats, drafting the language reviewing it, and at one point he changed a phrase she had written to something more specific and accurate, and she looked at the change and said, "That's better." And he said nothing, but she saw the fractional shift at the corner of his mouth that she had learned to read as the expression that substituted for what other men would have shown more plainly, and she returned to the letter and finished it. They were going to save the land. She was almost certain they were going to save the land. What she was not prepared for, what neither of them were prepared for, was what Calhoun did when he understood that his arithmetic was not going to resolve in his favor. The warning came from an unlikely source. Hobbs at the general store, who had known Calhoun long enough to understand the shape of the man, in the way that small-town proprietors understand everyone who passes through their door, sent his boy out to the ranch on a Saturday morning with a note that said only Calhoun brought in men from Laramie. Not his usual crew. 3 more. Be careful. Elias read the note at breakfast, and his face went through the rapid controlled sequence she had come to recognize as him processing a danger and cataloging his available responses. He folded the note and set it in his shirt pocket and looked at her across the table. "I want you to take the mare and go to Brennan's," he said. "No," she said. He looked at her with the patient, immovable quality of a man who has a reason. "Clara." "No," she said again. "Brennan is 8 miles, and I am not leaving this ranch with 6 or more men, possibly between here and there." She held his gaze with the steady, direct attention of a woman who has thought about this already, who has in fact been thinking about it since Calhoun rode away 12 days ago with the look of a man revising his approach. "I can shoot." A pause. "You can shoot," he repeated. "My father kept a rifle for the house. I learned early enough that the knowledge became ordinary." She set down her coffee. "Can you say the same about Brennan?" He was quiet for a moment, doing the calculation. She knew he was doing the same practical assessment he applied to everything. "Brennan is getting old," he said finally, "and his hands are seasonal." "Then I am more useful here than 8 miles away," she said. He looked at her for a long time with that expression that she still sometimes could not fully name, the one that had too much in it for any single word to carry. Then he said, "There's a second rifle in the barn, top of the tack room shelf." He stood up. "I'll show you where the ammunition is." She followed him to the barn in the morning light, and he showed her the rifle and the ammunition, and she checked the mechanism with the competent hands of someone for whom this was not a performance, and he watched her do it, and did not comment, which was its own form of acknowledgement. They did not speak much through the rest of that day. The work of the ranch continued because the work of the ranch always continued, regardless of what else was happening. The cattle wanted what they always wanted. The garden wanted water in the drought. Dry afternoon, the chickens conducted their ongoing dispute over the best position relative to the feed pan. Clara moved through these tasks with the focused attention she brought to everything, and underneath it kept the awareness of the South Road, the awareness of sound at the edge of audibility, the awareness of distance and angle, and what was between them and whatever might be coming. It came at night. It came in the way that serious things come, not announcing themselves until they are already present. The first sound, not hooves on the road, but a smell. Something that did not belong to the night air of the ranch, and she woke with a clarity that told her she had not been deeply asleep. Some part of her had been maintaining watch even in sleep. She smelled smoke. She was out of bed and at the window in the same motion looking out at the yard, and what she saw in the moonlight was 3 riders coming around the south side of the barn, and 2 more at the gate, and 1 figure crouching at the base of the fence that ran along the east side of the property, the posture of a man doing something deliberately and close to the ground. She took the rifle from where she had placed it, leaning against the wall beside the window before she went to bed. Because she was a woman who made practical decisions, and she went to the front room. Elias was already there. He had heard it or smelled it, or the same underground sense that ran in him like a second nervous system had pulled him awake with the same urgency. He was at the front window with his rifle, and he looked at her when she came in, and she took the position at the opposite side of the door, and they stood together in the dark front room of their house and looked out at what was coming. 6 at least, he said quietly. I count 7, she said. A pause. 7. He agreed. She could see the fire now, small but intentional, started at the base of the east fence, spreading along the dry grass with the eager efficiency of a fire that has been given good conditions and a clear direction. It would reach the barn in perhaps 15 minutes if it was not stopped, and it could not be stopped from inside the house, and leaving the house was what they wanted. Calhoun's voice came from the darkness beyond the gate, carrying the wide, unhurried quality of a man who believes he has already won. Voss, come out and talk terms, and this ends clean. You've got a nice place here. Shame to watch it go. Elias did not answer. I've got men on 3 sides, Calhoun continued, and that fire is going to make up its own mind about where it goes. Only one side open, and that's straight to me. A pause. Bring the woman. She can walk away from this. That's my offer. Clara watched the fire along the east fence and felt its light on the side of her face, and thought about the garden in its rows on the south side, and the chickens in their coop, and the mare in the paddock, and the hay in the barn, and 8 months of the daily accumulation of a life built in this place. And she felt the heat of the fire as a physical thing, and she felt something rise in her that was not fear, and not quite fury, but something that occupied the same essential territory as both, and burned with a similar quality. He expects us to come out, she said very quietly. Yes, Elias said. If we come out, he takes you and the land and the cattle and calls it a legal matter. Yes. She looked at the fire and at the riders positioning in the moonlight. What do we have? She said. Not a question about the rifles. She knew what the rifles were, a question about the broader inventory. He was quiet for a moment. 2 rifles, the water barrel on the porch, the root cellar entrance in the kitchen floor. He paused. And about 30 feet between the kitchen door and the canyon rim on the north side. She looked at him in the dark. The canyon. Cuts north for 2 miles and comes out on Brennan's property. He met her eyes. It's rough going in the dark. How rough? Rough enough that men who don't know it won't follow fast. She calculated. The riders were positioned south and east and west. The fire was east and moving. If they went north through the kitchen door and across the 30 feet to the canyon rim, they would be moving away from every man Calhoun had placed toward the one direction he had not covered, because the canyon was not a direction that looked like escape from the outside. It looked like a dead end if you did not know it. But the barn was between them and the north, and the fire was between them and the barn, and the cattle were in the south pasture, and they were going to lose all of it. She saw it on his face. The knowledge of what going north meant what they would leave behind. The ranch, the cattle, the barn he had built first and lived in for a winter while the house went up. 4 years of work before she arrived, and 8 months of work since, and all of it standing in the firelight right now in the specific, irreplaceable form of a life built by hand. She saw him calculating the loss. She watched him reach the end of the calculation, and she saw what he found there. We go north, he said, and his voice was flat and final, and she heard in it the quality of a man who has made a decision. At a cost he will carry a long time. And she heard something else in it too, the specific sound of a man for whom the calculation had resolved in a particular direction because of a particular weight on one side. And she was that weight, and she knew it. Elias, she said. We go north, he said again, and he was already moving toward the kitchen. She followed him. He lifted the kitchen door and dropped into the root cellar first and reached back up for the rifles, and then she dropped down after him, and he was already at the far end, pulling back the exterior hatch that opened on the north side of the house, below the porch line, out of sight of the riders. The night air came in, and with it the smell of the fire stronger now, and the sound of Calhoun calling again from the south. They came out on the north side of the house in the moonlight, and Elias grabbed her hand, just her hand in his, in the dark, and they ran. The 30 feet to the canyon rim was across open ground, and she did not look back at the fire, and she did not look at the riders, and she ran with the full commitment of her body, the rifle in her free hand, and his hand around her other, and the moonlit ground under her feet. And they reached the rim, and he went over first, and she went over after him, and the canyon wall was steep and rough and entirely real in the dark, the stone cold under her hands, the sage scraping her arms, and they went down into it the way you go into something that has no soft option with everything you have. She heard the shout from above, one of Calhoun's men, finding the hatch, or seeing them go over, she could not tell which, and then she was too deep in the canyon to hear anything above the sound of her own breathing and the loose rock under their feet, and Elias's voice just ahead of her saying quietly, "Here, step down here. Give me your hand again." She gave him her hand, and he guided her down a section where the wall had crumbled into a rough staircase, and then they were on the canyon floor, and he released her hand, and they were moving north the canyon walls on either side in the moonlight, making a corridor of rock and shadow, and the stars overhead, very close and very bright. They moved for what felt like a long time, but was perhaps 20 minutes. The sound of the fire was gone. The sound of any pursuit was gone. The canyon had swallowed them both and kept its own counsel about it. She heard Elias slow and stop, and she stopped beside him, breathing hard, and they stood in the dark canyon floor and listened to the silence. Nothing followed. She looked at him in the moonlight. His face was cut along the jaw from a rock, a thin line of dark in the pale light, and there was dust in his hair, and a tear in the sleeve of his shirt, and he was looking not at her, but back down the canyon in the direction they had come from, back toward the south, where the sky above the canyon rim was orange. She did not have to look to know what the orange meant. She looked at him, looking at it. She watched him stand in the dark canyon and watch his life burn from the safe distance of 200 feet of vertical rock, and she understood that the fire was real, and the loss was real, and the cost of the decision he had made in the kitchen was landing on him right now in the orange light on the rim above them, with the full weight of everything it meant. She did not say anything for a long time. She stood beside him and let him have the grief of it, which was its own kind of respect. The respect of not rushing a person through a real thing, not offering words that would only diminish the space the loss needed. After a while, he said quietly, without looking at her, "I had the money from the spring sale in the house, cash, inside the main room." He was quiet for a moment. "The Cheyenne contracts, they're gone." She processed this. "The copies are in my trunk," she said. He looked at her. "I made copies of everything," she said, "when I reorganized the accounts. The originals stayed in the house, and I kept copies in my trunk because I was raised by a man who understood that money is only as safe as the number of places it exists." She paused. "The trunk went north with us." She did not have the trunk. She had left it on the porch in June and taken it back inside, and it had been under her bed ever since, and she had pulled it out before she dropped into the root cellar and left it at the head of the hatch, and she had it now. She had carried it down the canyon wall and along the canyon floor without thinking about it, as anything other than the thing she took when she left, because it was the thing she always took when she left, and inside it were the copies of every document that mattered. Elias looked at the trunk in the moonlight. Then he looked at her. "The original contracts are gone," she said, "but the Stockmen's Association has their copy, and we have ours, and a contract is a contract regardless of what happens to one party's paper version." She set the trunk on the canyon floor. The land itself is not burned. Calhoun has done nothing that changes the legal standing of the claim. He stared at her. He has committed arson, she said, and there are 2 witnesses. She looked at him steadily. This is not over. This is not even close to over. He stood very still in the moonlight for a long moment. The orange above the rim had begun to fade, which meant the fire was consuming what it had and finding less to consume, which meant the structures were gone. But the fire was not spreading beyond the immediate property. The drought-dry grass was the risk, and there was enough open ground between the buildings and the pasture that the cattle were likely safe. He reached out, and she felt his hand on her face, just his palm against her cheek, brief and complete. And she held still, and let it be what it was, and what it was everything that he did not have other language for, and had perhaps never had other language for a man whose most honest expression was always a gesture rather than a word, and this was the most honest thing she had ever seen him do. Then he dropped his hand and picked up the trunk and said, "Brennan's is 2 miles north." "Then we should walk," she said. They walked. Brennan was an old man who answered his door in the middle of the night with the unhurried composure of someone who has lived long enough in this country to know that the middle of the night is when the real things happen. And he took one look at them, the cut on Elias's jaw, and the dust on Clara's dress, and the trunk and the rifles, and said, "Come in," and asked no questions until they had eaten something and the coffee was on the stove. Then Elias told him in the careful, sequential way he reported everything what had happened from the first visit in May to the canyon an hour ago. Brennan listened without interrupting. When Elias was finished, Brennan looked at Clara and said, "The contracts." "We have copies," she said, "and the association in Cheyenne has the originals." Brennan nodded once the nod of a man assessing a position. "Sheriff in Drybone Valley has been watching Calhoun for 3 years. He's been waiting for something he can bring to the territorial judge." He looked at his coffee. 7 men setting a fire in the night on a homestead with the property owners inside is something. 2 witnesses, Clara said. 2 witnesses, Brennan confirmed. He looked between them. "You can stay here as long as you need." They stayed 3 days. On the first day, Elias rode to Drybone Valley with Brennan and gave a full account to the sheriff, who took it with the careful attention of a man writing something that he intends to use. And the men Calhoun had brought from Laramie were found still in town and were identified, and the identification was recorded. Calhoun himself had departed before dawn, which the sheriff noted was the behavior of a man who understands he has crossed into territory from which reputation cannot retrieve him. Clara spent the first day writing. She wrote to the Stockmen's Association in Cheyenne explaining what had happened and confirming the contract terms and requesting that the original signed documents be held securely pending resolution of a legal matter. She wrote a clear, precise account of every interaction with Calhoun from May through the night of the fire, with dates and witnesses where available. She wrote it with the same careful, structured competence she brought to the accounts building the case in language that was factual and specific and would not give a territorial judge anything to misunderstand. Elias read what she had written that evening and set the pages down and said, "You should have been a lawyer." "I should have been many things," she said without bitterness. "I am working with what I have." He looked at her across Brennan's table. "What you have," he said slowly, "is considerable." She looked back at him and felt the warmth of it, without diminishing it and without performing anything about it, just felt it plainly, and said, "So do you." On the second day they rode back to the ranch together. The house was gone. She had known it was gone, and she had prepared herself for the knowledge of it, but knowing and seeing were different in the way that all things are different when they become real, and she stood in the yard with the ash still warm in places and looked at what was left, which was the chimney. standing like a declaration in the middle of the ruin, and the stone foundation cleared of everything above it, and the remains of the porch steps leading up to nothing, and she let herself look at it steadily, without flinching, because she was a woman who looked at things steadily. The barn was gone. The coop was gone. The chickens, she discovered with a complicated relief, had not been in the coop, had been roosting in the lower branches of the cottonwood on the north side of the yard, where they apparently spent summer nights, and they were there now watching the activity in the yard with the affronted dignity of animals whose routine has been significantly disrupted. The garden was untouched. The fire had come from the east, and the garden was on the south side, and the open ground between had been enough. The beans were climbing their stakes in the morning light with the serene indifference of growing things that have not been informed of the catastrophe, and the squash spread its large leaves along the south wall that was still standing lowest course of stone, and the carrots were down there in the earth doing what carrots do, which is persist. The mare was in the pasture. The cattle were in the south pasture. The windmill was turning. Elias walked through the ash, and she walked with him, and he stopped at what had been the front room, and she stood beside him and looked at the stone floor. Still there, the same stone he had laid when he built the house before she arrived. And she looked at it and thought about the floor being there when the walls were gone, and thought about what that meant, about what things endure when the structure built on top of them burns down. He crouched and picked up something from the ash. She looked and saw that it was the iron of the wood stove. The door of it still intact, the cast-iron hinge that had been there on the first morning she had built a fire in it in September, still functional in a heap of ash because iron survives what wood does not. He set it back down. She reached into the trunk she had set on the cleared ground beside them and took out the marriage certificate. She had taken it from the document folder when she reorganized the accounts because it was a document and it belonged with the others, and it had been in the trunk through everything through June, when she packed and unpacked and through the canyon and through the 3 days at Brennan's, and it was slightly singed at one corner from something that had happened in the root cellar or the descent, some proximity to heat that had left its mark but not destroyed it. She held it out to him. He looked at it. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and took out the copy of the Cheyenne contract which he had been carrying since she gave it to him. He held both things in his hands, the contract and the certificate, the two documents that between them described the legal architecture of what they had built here, and he looked at them for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "I once wrote," he said slowly, choosing each word with the care of a man who has learned the cost of words chosen carelessly, "that I needed someone to hold this land." He looked at the ash around them, the stone floor, the standing chimney. "The land is still here." He looked at her. "You held it." She held his gaze. "I know what I owe you," he said. "I know it isn't a piece of paper, but I want you to have the choice." He held out the certificate to her. "If you want to go, if this is not the life you would choose given the choice, take the mare and whatever you need, and I will not say a word except that you are owed more than I have been able to give." She looked at the certificate in his hand. She looked at the ash and the stone floor and the standing chimney and the garden that had not burned and the windmill turning in the morning light and the mountains to the west, catching the first gold of the day and the chickens in the cottonwood, judging everything with their small, relentless eyes. She looked at the man standing in the ruin of his life with his hand extended and no performance of anything on his face, only the plain, undefended truth of a man who is offering someone a door and hoping she will not use it and showing her the door anyway, because that is the kind of man he has always been underneath the frost and the economy of words and the letters written in the language of transactions, the kind of man who repairs things quietly and carves patience into wood and places himself between people he cares about and whatever is coming. She took the certificate from his hand. She looked at it for a moment, the slightly singed corner. Her name and his in the territorial judge's handwriting, done and legal and real. She tore it in half. He went very still. She tore it again, twice more precisely, into 4 pieces, and let them fall into the ash at their feet, the paper going down among the remains of everything else, and she looked at him across the falling pieces and said, "I am not staying because a paper tells me to." He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, had not known this face was capable of something open and unguarded and warm, in the way that a fire is warm when it is the right kind of fire, the kind that is in the right place and giving heat rather than taking everything. "Then why?" he said very quietly. She looked at the ash. She looked at the foundation. She looked at the chimney and the garden and the windmill and the chickens and the mountains. She crouched down there in the ash and the ruin, and her hand found what she was looking for, half buried under a fall of collapsed timber, its wooden handle burned away, but the iron head entirely intact, a thing made to drive stakes into hard ground and reset fences and build structures that endure. She stood up with it in her hand and felt the weight of it solid and certain. She looked at him. "Because we have a house to rebuild," she said. Something in his face completed itself, something that had been reaching toward a destination since September arrived. He looked at the hammer in her hand and then at her, and he said nothing, which was the right thing, and he reached out, and she put the hammer in his hand, and he took it, and kept her hand inside his around the handle, and they stood together in the ash of what had been and the foundation of what would be, and the morning light came across the valley from the east and caught the chimney and made a shadow of it, pointing west toward the mountains like a compass needle pointing toward the next thing, the only thing, the work ahead of them. The legal matter resolved in September. Calhoun was brought before the territorial judge in Cheyenne on charges of arson and conspiracy, the sheriff's carefully assembled case, buttressed by Clara's written account, and Elias's testimony and the statements of 2 of the men Calhoun had hired from Laramie, who proved willing to describe the specifics of the arrangement in exchange for reduced consideration. The judge was a practical man who had spent 15 years watching the territory either civilize itself or not, and he had a particular and documented distaste for men who used fire as a property acquisition strategy. Calhoun lost more than he had intended to gain. The territorial judgment included restitution, a number that was not everything they had lost, and was not nothing. And it cleared the bank note entirely, which was the number that mattered most, and left a margin besides. The Cheyenne contracts held. The fall cattle prices came in above the summer estimate, which meant the margin grew. Brennan, who had watched all of this with the approving attention of an old man who has seen enough of the country to know what to root for, sent 2 of his seasonal hands to help with the rebuild as a gift he refused to call a gift, calling it instead the repayment of a debt from September of last year, which Elias accepted in the same spirit. They built the barn first. Elias always built the barn first because the cattle needed shelter before people did, and Clara helped him raise the frame with the same full-body commitment she had brought to every other piece of this life, and at the end of the first day, when the frame was up and the roof rafters were in, she stood back and looked at it in the evening light, and thought about a man who had built a barn and lived in it for a winter while he built a house, and she understood something about him she had not fully understood before. Not the practicality of it, she had understood that, but the depth of the commitment underneath the practicality, the way a man who builds in that order is saying something about what he believes is worth building for. The house went up through October faster than the first one because there were 3 of them working and because the stone foundation was already true and did not need to be laid again. She made decisions about the new house that she had not been present to make. For the original one, the window on the south wall should be larger to let in more winter light. The kitchen should have a second shelf. There should be a proper door on the bedroom rather than the curtain that had served. Elias built what she described. He built it with the same patience and precision he brought to everything made by hand, the same quality she had first seen in the comb and had since found in every corner of this place. And on the afternoon that the last board went up on the porch, she stood on it and looked out at the valley in the October light. The aspens turned gold again along the creek. The ridge above them blue-shadowed the sky in its enormous and indifferent beauty, pressing down on a land that simply endured it, and she felt the house solid behind her, and the porch solid under her, and the mountains solid in the distance. And she thought that she had been right about what she had come to. She had come to something real, the realest thing she had ever had. She was still standing on the porch when he came around the corner of the house and stopped when he saw her. He had dust in his hair from the day's work and a level in his hand, and the last of the October light was on him, and he looked at her standing on the finished porch of the house they had built together on the foundation of the house she had arrived at as a stranger, and he said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "How does it sit?" She felt the boards beneath her feet, the solid level plane of the work done right. "True," she said. He came up the steps and stood beside her, and they looked out at the valley together, the long view south toward Drybone Valley, and the road they had both come in on from their different points of origin, and the view north toward the canyon that had gotten them out of the worst night, and the mountains to the west, and the ridge above, and the creek in its fall-low channel, catching the light. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "The letter," he said. "The one to your father." He was looking at the valley, not at her. "I have thought about those words every day since September, the 1st September. A pause. I have not been able to find a version of them that I can excuse, so I am not going to try." He was quiet for a moment. "What I can tell you is what I know now. What I know now is that you are the most extraordinary person I have encountered in this life. Not because you stayed when you could have gone, not because you stood in a yard with Calhoun and spoke law at him, not because you had the contracts in your trunk." He finally looked at her, and his face had nothing defended in it at all, no frost, no reserve, no economy of feeling. "Because when I handed you a door, you tore it up and picked up a hammer instead. And I have been trying to find words for what that means to me since the morning I watched you do it, and I still don't have them." She looked at him. She thought about a train moving west in the dark, and a woman making promises to herself about walls and bolts and the cost of trust. She thought about everything she had known in Philadelphia about what her life would be, and everything she had learned in Wyoming about what it actually was. She thought about what it meant to be known by someone, not the version of yourself you construct for safety, but the actual version, the stubborn version, the one who reorganizes the tool shelf and makes copies of everything and picks up the hammer. She thought that trust was still the most expensive thing she knew, and that the expense was real, and that she had paid it, and it had been worth it. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the cut long healed now, and he went very still, and she said, "You don't need the words. I know." He put his hand over hers and held it there, and they stood on the porch of their house in the October evening, with the valley spread before them, and the aspens burning gold along the creek, and the chickens conducting their evening commentary from the cottonwood, and the cattle settling in the south pasture, and the whole enormous, indifferent, beautiful country simply continuing to be what it was, asking nothing, offering everything to anyone willing to endure it. She was willing. She had been willing since the morning she stood in the ash and picked up the hammer, and perhaps before that, perhaps since the first morning she stood on the first porch and looked at the sky that was too large for anything small to survive in it, and felt the land enter her in a way that could not be taken back. She was home, not because she had been told to be, not because a piece of paper said so, not because the man beside her had written her name in a letter to another man in the cold language of a transaction she had not been given a voice in, but because she had chosen it with the full weight of everything she had been through and everything she had built, and everything she now knew about the cost of staying and the cost of leaving, she had chosen it. And that choice was hers entirely and irrevocably hers, the first thing in her life that no one had arranged or sold or decided without her. She stood on her porch on her land in the October light, and she felt the solid truth of all of it, and she let herself have it completely, without armor, without reservation, without the bolt on any door anywhere in her chest. The winter would come again. That was what winter did. It would come with its indifference and its demands and its long months of testing everything that wanted to survive it. The fences would need tending. The cattle would need tending. The garden would sleep, and the creek would freeze, and the wind would find every gap in every wall and make its case for the fragility of human things. And she would be here. She would be here with the hammer and the account books and the rifle on the wall and the comb on the table beside the mirror in the new bedroom with the proper door and the larger south window and all the rest of it, the accumulated ordinary daily weight of a life that was hers in every way. A life could be hers. She would be here, and so would he, and the land would hold them both, the way it had always held everything that was willing to stay, the way it had held the stone and the water and the grass and the deep-rooted patient things through every winter that had ever come and every spring that had followed, which was without sentiment and without ceremony and without any promise. Except the one the land has always made to everything that chooses to endure. The promise that the ground is still here. The promise that spring follows. The promise that what you build on a true foundation, even if it burns, is not gone, only waiting to be rebuilt. She looked out at the valley one last time in the fading light, and then she turned and went inside into the warm and solid house, and the door closed behind her, and the October dark came down on Drybone Valley, and the stars came out in their thousands over Wyoming, and the land lay under them in its ancient and patient silence, and everything that mattered was exactly where it was supposed to be.